Welcome to episode 240 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to Supervisory Special Agent Richard Marx, who joined the FBI in 1997. His initial assignment was to the Philadelphia Division, where he worked on a drug squad and later the bank robbery and fugitive squad. In this episode, Supervisory Special Agent Richard Marx, Richard, reviews the FBI recovery team he led at the Fresh Kills Landfill on Staten Island, where a multi-agency team carefully sifted through tons of World Trade Center debris to recover criminal evidence and the remains and belongings of the victims of September 11, 2001. The work at Fresh Kills, miles from Ground Zero and closed to the general public, is an important part of the 9/11 story that most people know nothing about. From September 12, 2001 to August 9, 2002, Richard was in charge of the site along with New York Police Department Inspector James Luongo and New York Bureau of Waste Disposal Deputy Director Dennis Diggins. During the 11-month operation, the forensic recovery effort examined 1.8 million tons of World Trade Center debris and recovered over 4,500 human remains and over 75,000 personal effects and processed over 1,300 vehicles. In 2006, Richard was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent in the Evidence Response Team Unit at the FBI Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, where he is currently assigned. Richard has been involved in the support efforts following most mass casualty events and natural disasters, both domestic and abroad, that have occurred during the nearly 25 years he has been with the FBI. We dedicate this episode to Special Agent Lenny Hatton and all of the victims of 9/11. This is the perfect episode for me to ask you to consider donating to the FBI Agents Association's Memorial College Fund and the Membership Assistance Fund. Currently, the Memorial College Fund supports over 50 children, 20 of them children of agents who passed away due to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode to the FBI Agents Association's Ways You Can Donate page. I hope you'll consider giving whatever you can afford to this worthy cause. There are also links in your podcast app's description of this episode to where you can sign up to become a member of my reader team and to visit my website to learn more about me, my books, and my blog. Reader team members, please check your inbox, spam filter, and promotions tab for my September email where I review the Samuel L. Jackson movie Unthinkable about fictional FBI agents who observed the use of torture during the interrogation of a terrorist. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Richard Marx. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing great. Now, I saw you about 2 years ago at the FBI lab. I was there with the Philadelphia Citizens Academy. And who walks in the door to give a presentation on the FBI lab but my old buddy, Richard Marx?
It was good to see you. Time passes very quickly in this organization. I always love seeing faces, especially from the Philadelphia office when they come up for Citizens Academy.
Yeah, so I asked you at the time, so when are you going to retire? Because I wanted to get you on the show, and you let me know that you still thought you had a lot of good years.
I do. I have several more years left. I was just telling somebody this morning, I really love what I do. I know it sounds corny in this day and age, but I do love what I do. I would do it till I was 70 probably because, you know, when you get to a certain level of expertise in our organization, it adds value to the mission, right? And so I still love what I do. And I do love going to work every day and still love working large scale mass disaster or mass casualty scenes.
So I told you at the time that I would make an exception. I rarely interview active agents, but in your case, I really, really wanted you to talk about 9/11 on the 20th anniversary. You were right there at the forefront of the investigation and the recovery, and there would be no one else that I would want to come on the anniversary show. So thank you. And thank you to FBI headquarters for allowing you to speak with me.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's a valuable learning lesson for mass casualty events. And I mean, it's still as fresh in my mind today as it was 20 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long ago. It's still freshly embedded, and I still see the faces of the people I worked with, and I can still imagine the smells and the machinery, the sound of the machinery. So it's very fresh still in my head, even all these years later.
Now, I remember where I was when the first plane hit. Where were you when you first heard about the plane hitting the World Trade Center?
So at that particular time, I was on the evidence response team in Philadelphia. I'd been in the Bureau about four years, I guess, roughly about that time. I was on the violent crime squad. Mike Carbonell was my supervisor on the bank robbery fugitive squad. I was really enjoying what I was doing at that time. I was doing the evidence response team work. I was also doing some of the airport liaison work as the airport agent, and then working bank robberies, which was our primary mission on that squad. So it was really a good time in my career. But at that particular day, I was up at Fort Dix. I was giving a presentation to the SWAT team. They were getting ready to do a arrest warrant on Carl Gagosian, which was, I think you've talked to Ray Carr about it on your show, but Carl Gagosian was one of the more prolific bank robbers in U.S. history. So we had unearthed a bunch of his weapons. I was going to give a presentation to the SWAT team to talk about the types of weapons that we had found in some of his buried caches of weapons. So that's where I was at. I was just starting to get into that. It was early in the morning, and I remember very distinctly, Everett Cook, the firearms instructor for the Philadelphia division, he came in, said a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I think, like most people, because I didn't have a TV on in the room there, I was thinking it was like a Cessna or a smaller plane. And then when a little bit time had passed, I remember him coming back in and saying another plane had hit the other tower. And that we all knew at that point that our lives and the day was going to be completely different from that point on. And all of us scrambled to get back to the field office at that point.
And I remember the SAC at the time, Bob Conforti, had us all gathered together in the office and told us all to go home, pack our bags, be prepared to travel to New York to begin work. And then several hours later, after we were all there, raring to go, I know I was, I wanted to help. I wanted to be of service. He let us know that they didn't need us all. But you were one of the people in the office that did go up.
That's correct. I remember being in that. It was kind of a command post that we had set up in the office there, and we were handling all of the calls coming in. As most people don't remember, we had thought Camp David had been hit. There was a lot of erroneous reporting initially from just, multitude of information coming in. The information flow was so steady that we were having to answer questions about, there's a plane coming into Philadelphia. And we would call up the tower and they'd say, that plane landed, 3 hours ago. So, there was a lot of late information coming in about planes and where they were headed. And most of them had already landed, but the information was late in coming. So I remember being there. I remember, our team getting ready to head up to New York. As you said, everybody was gearing up to go to New York, and our evidence response team was out of Philadelphia, was one of those teams that was tagged. So when they got ready to launch us, everybody's name was on the list to go except for mine. So it was a little bit unnerving because I had the airport responsibility, and I think that's why they wanted me to stay behind. So I remember being a little bit, I wanted to be there. This is what we train for. This is what we all go to evidence response team basic for, is these type large scale events. And so I remember going into TJ Harrington's office and saying, why am I not going? He was my ASAC at the time. He eventually went on to become the EAD for the FBI, but he said, it's not my fault. The SAC asked you to stay. And I said, well, do you mind if I go talk to him? And he said, no. And so I went into Mr. Conforti's office and I said, hey, do you mind if I go? And I laid out my case and he said, look, as long as you come back, I'll let you go. And so that's how it happened. And that's how I went to New York that day.
Oh, but you broke your promise, didn't you?
I did. I didn't come back right away. 11 months later is when I finally returned back.
So take us through everything that happened to you that first day.
The evidence response team out of Philly joined many other evidence response teams from across the country to respond to different sites. We sent teams to Shanksville, we sent teams to the Pentagon, but a majority of them during that time period got sent to New York City. And so when we got there, it was late the night of September 11th. We stayed at the Richmond Inn Hotel. It was down on Richmond Avenue there in Staten Island. And Newark Division doesn't get enough credit. Newark was really running the entire New York office response because the office was right there near ground zero. All its major communications were shut down. Telephones were not working in New York City. And Newark stepped up and really took command post and ran a lot of the 9/11 operation in New York. So we responded to the office, went up there, and we had meetings that night with New York ERT members, what they were seeing, where all the teams would be going. Some of the teams were going to go to ground zero to help at the morgue. Some of them were going to be stationed in a command post down there. New York's ERT was working a command post at ground zero. Our team, we volunteered to go up and be at the Fresh Kills Landfill. And prior to that time, I had never heard of Fresh Kills Landfill in Staten Island. For those that don't know, Fresh Kills is Dutch for fresh stream. Kills is Dutch for stream. So when people hear that, they instantly get some sort of, I think it was a name that was generated after 9/11, but it wasn't. It was a very old name from when it was founded. You also have Arthur Kills up there. So the streams were named Kills up in Staten Island. And so we were going to go out and set up a sifting operation. And at that time, you have to look at it the way the Twin Towers collapsed. When the towers came down, they did a lot of damage to the surrounding buildings. So there were 7 buildings that were impacted, a Marriott Hotel, Customs House, which was in Building 6. There was a lot of agencies like the Secret Service that were in Building 7. The Office of Emergency Management for the City of New York was in Building 7. All of that was damaged. There was fuel tanks in the bottom of Building 7 that caught fire, eventually caused that building to fall down as well. So there was a lot of damage at ground zero. And you have to kind of imagine your fireplace at home when things burn. That building had been on fire for a long time, then it collapsed. And so it was kind of like having a fireplace at home where all of the logs had burned down, but there was hot coals and embers underneath. There was hot temperatures in that building for months afterwards. So when they first started digging out the material, it was very hot. You have to remember, it melted the aluminum. It caused I-beams to fold over and collapse because of the heat from the jet fuel. And so as they're digging through this stuff initially, bringing it out to us, we would have tractor trailers that the load would catch on fire, literally going down the interstate. So you almost have to imagine like when you're breathing on the coals, blowing on the coals of a fireplace, you can actually cause the fire to reignite. And that's what we were seeing as they were digging the material out. So we started bringing the material out to Fresh Kills that night. And obviously, the primary mission that we were involved in was trying to find evidence of the terrorist acts and any evidence of it in the debris. So we were looking, the flight recorders from the planes. And obviously that changed relatively quickly because it became really a huge humanitarian mission for the city of New York and the country as well to recover all of the victims from ground zero. But as we started digging through this pile of debris and bringing it out, we had to change strategies. And I think that's one of the talking points that, you'll see when you go through this whole thing is that we were really kind of writing history on something that had never been done on a scale before. And it really kind of followed me the rest of my days on other scenes that, if something's not working, you have to own that and change it immediately because it doesn't benefit anybody to keep trying a failed process. So for us, once we realized something wasn't working, we changed it. But our team got up there that morning to Fresh Kills on the morning of the 12th after being briefed the night of the 11th. And we inherited 175 acres on top of hill number 9 that had no running water, no electricity, no anything. It was just a flat 175 acres of mud that used to be a landfill. This part of the landfill shut down in March of that year, and it was getting ready to be capped. And for those that don't know, the landfill there is now a bird sanctuary. It's a very picturesque area that overlooks the river there, but at that time was just a flat tundra of area that we could work. There was nowhere in downtown New York City that we could have done a sifting operation of this size to do what we did as far as sifting the debris from the World Trade Center. that decision to move all the material out there to Fresh Kills was done by Chief Ali, who was the chief of detectives for the New York City Police Department. He was the one who made the call that said, hey, we don't have the room down here while we're doing recovery operations looking for victims. Let's move this stuff out to Fresh Kills. Let's do it out at Staten Island. And so that's where the process of moving this material out there started.
We all know about evidence recovery and the chain of custody. So you're doing recovery, but you're also searching for evidence. How was that handled as you moved the debris from inside, New York City out to Staten Island?
Well, for one thing, one of the primary things we were looking for was the flight recorders. And so as the trucks were being loaded, ground zero, and this, mind you, this didn't last very long, the trucks, because of the issue with the fire and the same concerns that you raised. We wanted to be able to track those vehicles going from point A to point B. And so for the trucks, when they were being loaded, in an attempt to try to find these black boxes, the flight recorders on the plane have a underwater pinger. So when a plane goes down in the water, like flight TW800 that went down, to find the flight recorder, it starts pinging once it's submerged. So the idea was floated, and we tried it for a while. They tried flooding the trucks at ground zero with water to see if they could activate the pinger. So they would spray them down with water and try to hear the pinger. But it was really kind of a futile effort, because when you think about it, how big these buildings were, the level of destruction that came out of the falling steel, it was really wasn't going to happen. That method was not going to work. So we started loading the trucks. Once we started having issues with them going down the interstate and an occasional fire breaking out, and just the sheer volume that it was taking to move them out there from downtown, it was just going to be a long period. So the people that came to help was the Department of Sanitation. Fabulous bunch of individuals that normally work at the Staten Island landfill. They have a barge system. Now, nowhere else in the country you could probably do this other than the city of New York, because they had a very elaborate operating barge system that allowed them to fill barges full of trash out of New York City and bring it to the landfill for disposal. And they had some of the biggest heavy machinery as far as excavators and trucks that you'll ever see. Just a phenomenal operation. One of my friends, Dennis Diggins, was in charge of the sanitation at Fresh Kills. It was a team effort with his folks handling that material. So every day we would load up the barges from ground zero and bring them out, float them right down the river. It was much easier to track them and show chain of custody, because we would load each barge and we were measuring them by tonnage, and we would get, maybe 650 tons per barge, and there would be about 17 barges a day of material that was coming in. So we knew how much material was being moved, and we could track it, and we knew how much we were processing at the scene. So we became this evolving operation of actually moving the debris out and stockpiling it at Fresh Kills. And then while we were doing that, we were building an entire city. So we had a couple of different things going on at the same time. When we started the operation, we took kind of lessons learned from past mass events. And at that time, the biggest bombing we'd had besides Oklahoma City was the Nairobi bombings. And I went to the Nairobi bombing in August of 1998, along with other individuals from our office, Jack Meehan, a lot of the folks that were on ERT at the time, Mary Beth Kepner, all those folks that you probably recognize from the Philly office. They came out and deployed to Nairobi with us. Chris Rigopoulos was another one. We deployed to use those techniques that we use in Nairobi. And so the technique started out as you would take a front end loader, you would load it with material, and then as the front end loader would back up, it would gently shake the material out on the ground. And then the teams would come out and walk through it and look for personal effects, evidence from the planes or pieces of the plane, anything that might be terrorism related. At the time, we were looking for any types of beepers, ways of communication, walkie-talkies, cell phones. We were looking for box cutters, because that was the information we had at the time, that they had box cutters. And so we were looking for any of those items. Now, really, when you think about it, you think about how many beepers, how many phones, how many box cutters were in the World Trade Center. I remember just the first few days while we were there, when we were collecting this, just buckets, 5-gallon buckets full of beepers, phones, and they were ringing. That was the most eerie part about it. They were still ringing.
Wow.
And to hear that. So, and we had boxes of box cutters, because you think about every shipping department in those two buildings that had box cutters, there was a lot of box cutters. So we collected it all as we were going through this process. And then we started evolving the process. So our process evolved from how to handle this material, stockpiling it, to processing it. And so we started preparing for things like winter because we knew that it was going to be coming. We knew that we had to build structures for the people working. We had to set up tents that they could dress out in. I mean, you're running an operation that has 1,000 people a day. And when you think of the PPE or the personal protective equipment they have to wear, like respirators and Tyvek suits and rubber booties, and each person is going through at least 2 to 3 pairs of Tyvek rubber booties a day, it becomes a major operation when you're going through 3,000 anything a day. It becomes so you're having to stockpile it by a semi truck. And so we actually had to set up a logistics supply area where we got in large inventories of pallets of PPE, just things that we could provide to the people for their safety. What respirators, fit testing, we had to get them fit tested, played an integral role in the setting up the operation. So
how long had you been in the FBI at the time that you set this up?
I'd been in the Bureau 4.5 years.
Yeah. So I can understand how you would know the investigative part, the operational part of recovery and evaluating evidence. But all of this administrative stuff, this logistics stuff, I mean, how were you able to get your arms around that to be able to set that up?
I think most of when it started, like most of America, everybody wanted to help, right? There was tons of outpouring and these type of things from just everybody across the country. And being there, I wanted to have a particular direction because you're taking something that really you have to process like a crime scene, but it's so much bigger and so much more tonnage. I mean, we processed 1.8 million tons of debris. And so you have to start thinking outside the box a little bit. And I think I just kind of thrust myself into the leadership role at that point because we really didn't have any clear guidance. I mean, the country was really on its own at that point. We were really just trying to do the FBI proud, do what we could to help the victims, because obviously they're going to be your biggest critics at the end of the day. Because if you don't treat them right and fair, then they're going to be outspoken about it. And so,
you mean their families?
That's correct. The victims' families would be the ones that would let you know that you're not doing a good job. So in that sense, we wanted to do right by them. And so once you make the victims' families and recovering them the priority, it really all kind of falls in place. So I really kind of, along with Mike O'Brien and the rest of the folks from the Philly ERT team, we kind of went out there and said, look, we're here, we're going to take charge and we're going to kind of run this operation. And that's what we did. So we started making a plan of how to set this city up on top of the landfill. So we started the process. We eventually, the New York ADIC, Barry Mon, came out there about 45 days into it. At that time, they'd pretty much made up their mind. They knew what had happened. They saw it on videotape and trying to get an idea about how we were handling the process out there. And so I made an argument about why we needed to be there and, how important it was to our working relationship with the New York City Police Department. And, that's when he turned to me and said, good, you're in charge. And so that's how I kind of got appointed to being there.
And that was 45 days after you had already been there and been in charge.
Sure. Yep. It's just the way the Bureau works. I think is because it was working so well that we were sending daily reports in on what we were finding. And I think people just didn't have an issue with the way it was running. And so when he came out there, our team had already rotated out. I stayed behind for continuity to help, introduce the following teams to what we were doing and try to keep some consistency. I had envisioned going home at some point. And, I talked about, because I worked with Lenny Hatton, who died in the attacks. And, I felt passionate about finding Lenny. And so, I worked with him in Nairobi along with, a lot of other people. And so we felt very passionate about finding him. So, when I laid all that argument out to the ADIC, I think that's when he said, this is the guy for the case. And so that's why I stayed out there.
Who from the NYPD did you work with?
I first was dealing with some uniformed police officers from the New York City Police Department out in Staten Island about the first day or so. But in the second day, I had a gentleman, he was a Deputy Inspector, Jimmy Luongo. Jimmy came out there the second day and look, I came from Philly. I knew I could handle myself, with Philly cops and stuff, but I knew that the Bureau and the NYPD at that particular time had some rough patches. And so I didn't want to be an extra rough patch. And so, I went out there. Jimmy and I met that first day. And you have to remember, you have to think of the conditions we're in. We're out there. Jimmy's in the back of an very old command post. It looked like a UPS truck. It was painted blue. I met him in the back of the truck. It didn't take long for us to become fast friends. He's still one of my great friends. He retired this year after a very long and distinguished career with the New York City Police Department. Just a phenomenal guy and the kind of guy you want on your side. And, I think it was during that time period because of 9/11 and the feeling of camaraderie that really helped. And I think we just were so alike in our drive to do what was right by the victims' families that we hit it off so well. But you're out there, you're meeting a guy for the first time right outside the back of this command post. We're living out of tents. The ground is literally bubbling from methane because you're building on top of a landfill. And a landfill is kind of like a layer that's topped with soil. And so as we're putting more material on it and the ground becomes wet, you can actually see the methane from the trash below that's actually bubbling up to the ground during this time period. I remember it was much like walking through a milkshake every day for the first week we were up there. And so you're getting to meet people. You're really having to sales pitch the FBI's experience in mass casualty scenes. And you're also having to work in the framework of a city that you're not accustomed to working in. I'm from the Philly office. I've never worked in New York City till that day. So it was a huge learning curve of learning all the agencies. By the end of it all, we had 24 state and federal agencies up there. Just about everybody was up on top of that hill. We had 24,000 people that worked at the forensic recovery operation at Fresh Kills Landfill during its 11 months. It was a lot of people. It was a lot of liaison work. It was, everybody in their agencies has that guy that you don't want to send to deal with people. And so this was that situation where if they sent that guy, it usually fixed itself relatively quickly because you were in an environment that was all about teamwork. And all those agencies did exactly what they were responsible for because there was more than enough work. There was nobody jockeying to take somebody else's job or anything like that because there was more than enough work for all the agencies involved, whether it be the EPA, whether it be the Bureau of Prisons. They sent people up to help, Federal Bureau of Prisons, all the numerous townships from around New York and New Jersey, even Los Angeles Police Department, people came out. The outpouring of police officers and help was just enormous. And the local community there, I can't say enough about Staten Island as a whole, because all of the folks that were there that provided meals in those first days for all the workers, just all the kids that sent pictures in. I still have some hand drawing thank you notes that I saved from our command post. Those mean the world, especially when you're doing 16-hour days. We were working 24 hours straight all the way up till about middle of October, but we were working 24 hours straight, 7 days a week.
And how long did it take you to go from a operation where things were placed on the ground and you kind of shifted through them manually to the point where you got to the well-oiled machine where they were using conveyor belts?
When we started the operation, process was a little bit slower of handling the material, of using a front-end loader to back up and dump it out on the ground. And again, this is like I was talking about earlier. If you've got something you can improve on it, let's do it. Let's make a decision. Let's go forward on it. And so that really excelled us to myself and Jimmy to get, ideas about how to handle this. And so we started looking at sifting debris that's used for demolition work, like that they use at facilities to separate house products like wood and soil and things like that. So we started looking at these power sifters, machines that would allow us to take just raw material and it would break it down into, once you stripped out the heavy items, the big bulky items like the I-beams, you could take the rest of the material that was concrete, rebar, and soil, and you could actually take that and put it on these power screens, and they would actually separate out the material into a medium material and a fine material. And the medium material, we would actually take that medium-sized material and actually spread it out still the same way using either an excavator or a grappling, excavator to spread it out on the fields and let the people walk through it. Rebar can become very tangled. You had a lot of pulverization of items in your office. When you think about, you're sitting there listening to this in your cubicle at work, think about everything in your cubicle, and then it just gets pulverized, because that's what happened at the World Trade Center, because these I-beams weighed 650 pounds per foot. Altogether, they're very heavy, dense steel, and it pulverized everything. So the things that we were finding in the debris field, you might find the casters of a desk chair, circuit boards from a computer, but nothing on your desk that was recognizable. Yeah, it was very surreal because you didn't see those type of things. And all of that stuff got burned, melted. And so it changed the look of things, as you saw it laying out on the fields. When you would put it on the power screener, the metal and the concrete would fall off one side, and this fine dirt-like material that would fall through it would be the remnants of sheetrock, fiber, board, wood, anything that was in the building that got pulverized was reduced to this mound of almost like dirt and soil. So we had to sift through all of that to make sure you weren't missing personal effects or human remains out of that. So it was a very tedious task. And by bringing in those power screeners and those sifting machines, it really changed the operation. We used those machines within a month of the operation. We started moving towards that. We started setting up large structures called sprung tents that we had out there, these big tents that were made by Sprung Industries out in Utah. They made these giant tents that we could do covered work areas. Again, we figured we would be working through the snow, the winter, and luckily we had a mild winter that year, but we had started setting up the operation where the detectives and the agents could work on these conveyor belts under shelters that they wouldn't get rained on. They had lights. They had a heat source so they could stay warm, because you couldn't expect people to be focused on what they were doing if they were miserable in the elements. And we wanted to make sure that we gave this debris that was coming down from ground zero the best look possible. So for us, it was important to have the people sitting there and rotating them out fairly frequently. If they were on a conveyor belt, we only let them do 15 minutes at a time, because then at some point your eyes glaze over because the material is all the same size. We didn't want that to happen. We wanted to make sure we were given the best possible look at every piece of material that was coming off that building. So we would rotate our teams out and give them the power. Each team that was on a conveyor belt, they had the independent power to stop a belt, say, hey, slow down. I need to speed slower because I want to get a good look at it. Stop it. I want to make sure this is not something important. And so by having that independent control on each belt, you were not, just running material through it. You were actually giving them control to look for it, because everybody was passionate there. Everybody was looking for a friend, a relative, somebody they knew from New York City. And that was the heartbreaking part of it, because this thing reached across every ethnic, religious, demographic. It didn't matter if you're black, white, Asian. It didn't matter what religion you were. This terrorist event struck across all of that and unified the searchers to look for it. One of the things I always say is that, the Tyvek, the white outfits that they wear to keep themselves from getting debris or anything on them, really bonds people together, because you don't know who they're with. You just know they're out there for a common goal. You don't know if they're a detective, they're an agent, what agency they're with. It just bonds everybody together.
That makes sense. So are you ready to give us some stats?
Sure. Out there at the landfill, besides the 24,000 people we ran through it, at the Fresh Kills site, recovery site, we recovered 75,000 personal effects. And you have to remember, a lot of the personal effects were not only of the deceased, but of the living. By all intents, this was a hugely successful evacuation process. We had 3,000 casualties, but it could have been so much worse. Thank goodness the firefighters and the police officers that worked at the scene. And then out of that, we also processed about 1,300 vehicles that came out of ground zero. So, all the first responder cars, we had probably over 100 fire engines. We had hundreds of police cars, all damaged that the buildings had dropped on it that were recovered out there. We recovered just out of the sifting operation there at the landfill, 4,500 human remains, which is, huge. It gives somebody, hopefully, some identification. And I think people have to remember that this is still an active, ongoing investigation. People are still attempts at making identifications. I think year before last, they had another identification. There's not a lot of news out of it. You do see it occasionally where they make a new identification, mainly because the techniques in DNA have come so far. And it's mostly because of 9/11 that a lot of the techniques on fragmented human remains and burnt human remains have gone as far as they are. But, when you're talking about an incident where you produce highly fragmented remains, this is crucial. I think roughly at the end of it all, they were looking at almost 20 some odd thousand human remains. To this date, we only have identified half of the 3,000 that perished in the terrorist attack. So it's vitally important to those family members out there that still want to bring their loved one home to have somebody to bury. I mean, it's important to all of them. I mean, I remember getting letters from a guy that was a U.S. Marshal. His mom perished in the 9/11 terrorist attack, and we got back her purse and was able to give it to him. And that meant the world to him, just by giving back personal effects to people. You know, when you have a terrorist event like that, the only thing they did wrong was they went to work that day. They were innocent bystanders that were affected by terrorists. And so when you give somebody back something that was recovered from the attack, it means the world to them, because that was might be a family ring. I remember one of the rings was identified through a newspaper. Somebody saw it on a newspaper, had a distinctive cross on it, and it was identified a celebrity's. It was related to a celebrity, and they identified it and were able to get it back. Likewise, we just the sheer little things that people could give back to their families, like one of the cards was found belonging to one of the flight attendants on the plane. The things that seemed to last were credit cards because they were much more pliable. When you go through an operation like that, and you're finding not only the victims, but the personal effects, and you're able to give that back to them, it's huge to a family member. And we had one vehicle recovered several months later. The husband perished in the attacks. The wife had a birthday. That was that day. And we found his birthday present to her in the trunk of his Jaguar later on when we cracked it open. And that kind of stuff means a lot to them. I mean, I've had family members bring me a package of their missing loved one's favorite treat from a movie theater, snow caps. I still remember that. I still have the thank you note on the outside of the snow cap wrapper. That's what really brought it home to all of us. You had family members that would come up there, 60 of them at a time, and would talk to me and Jimmy about their loved one, and you got a sense of who that person was. They wanted answers, but we gave them very transparent, unrestricted access to the whole operation, because we knew, like we talked about earlier, the family members are going to be your biggest critics. And so when they wanted to see this operation, part of us wants to protect them from seeing things that they shouldn't see of their loved ones. But by giving them that access, they saw that the care and the work that everybody up there was doing at the operation, how they respectfully treated the remains when they found them, how they were transported over and examined, how we cataloged everything. So it was good for them to see that. And I think it helps them, hopefully to this day, to know that we cared and we did the best with the equipment we had available. Because we thought initially when we started, this would be like a 2-year project. And it got to the point where we had built this operation. Con Ed ran a power station up there. We had 100 phone lines. We had all of this city built to help process this. At the end of it all, the only thing that we have to show for it is what the family members feel. Because like most things, if you build something, there's something left over. This place now is a scenic bird sanctuary, the landfill there. It's where the Twin Towers, the remains of it, are at. And, this is all stuff from an operation that lasted 11 months, but there's nothing to show for it, because at the end of it all, we were so thorough that we went through and power washed down every barge to make sure we got every last little bit of debris. We bulldozed up the working fields to make sure that nothing got lost in the mud. And we ran that through the screeners as well. So we wanted to make sure that we did the best coverage as possible.
Well, of course, the 9/11 attacks are something that this country and the world will never forget. And many of the items that were recovered are now in museums. Could you talk to us a little bit about those items that were recovered and where they are and the significance of why they're in museums?
Most of all of us that were there didn't really think of it as a defining point of history. Even now, people refer to it as post 9/11. It was definitely a turning point, how different things, culture, government, everything changed at that point. And so the Smithsonian was given the power to collect items for museums, and a lot of the other museums came on board as well. So there was items sent to the Smithsonian, things like George Bush's bullhorn that he dressed people, and a cell phone. And so a lot of the pop culture items, some of those ended up at Smithsonian, as well as pieces of debris. One of the biggest collections is probably the New York State Museum in Albany. Mark Shamming's the director up there. It became a huge collection of all the items from 9/11, whether it be worker shirts, fire engines, steel, personal effects, pieces of the memorial wall, like the fence where people put missing posters or flowers at. All that became an integral part of their exhibit. Also, the 9/11 memorial, it was a huge recipient of a lot of that material. And even our FBI's, or the FBI experience here at the headquarters, has pieces of the airplane, the engines. Many of those were loaned to the museum, which is now since closed, but all of those items that were recovered or maintained by either the FBI or these museums is pieces of history. So it was a little bit weird because, we're not used to being a part of a historic thing. I go to museums now and I see items that we collected from Fresh Kills for the museums, like ambulance doors and things like that. And it's really very surreal because you'll see a plain piece that has your name on it. I'll see it with SSA Marx on it. And for me, it's very surreal to see something that is now a national treasure. It's in a museum. They handle it with white gloves. And it was something that we just, moved around with heavy machinery to get it relocated. But we didn't really see ourselves in that particular instance being a part of history, but it turned out that way. And so it's good that people can go to the museums and see these pieces and see the level of destruction that was caused by this terrorist attack so that future generations can understand it. It's just that when you see something so twisted and finally figure out that, oh, that's a fire engine or that's a police car, that's really something to see. Because, images like that stick with you. There was a police car there that I remember was probably not more than 2 feet tall. This police car had been flattened and it was almost from front to back, 2 feet tall, all the way across. And it still had its lights on, still had the police radio blaring in it. And they brought it all the way up to Fresh Kills. When you see that level of destruction and what the first responders and the victims that perished that day went through, it's a very humbling and a very sobering experience to see that.
Yes, before it closed, I toured the news museum and did see pieces of recovered debris that had your signature and date on it. And it definitely was a surreal moment for me that really kind of magnified the work that you did.
It wasn't just me. It was Jimmy. It was Bruce Bovino, who was a lieutenant in the New York City Police Department. It was Special Agent Tina Kinney. All of these folks that worked there provided a vital assistance to this country for recovering that stuff. Jimmy and I, we were in charge of it, but there were so many workers. We had 24,000 people rotating through there because they felt passionate about it. They deserve as much credit as anybody for working as hard as they did. Many of those folks came back tour after tour after tour to work up there at Fresh Kills. They are the unsung heroes. They'll only be known because they signed in every day on that log to sign in at the work site. Their names are on those logs, but they wanted no publicity. They just came out there to do what they knew was right and do what was important for the country. The 1,300 vehicles that were recovered, Fresh Kills, Jerry Fernino, who's a now retired Special Agent bomb tech, he used to be in the New York office up in the Hudson Valley, RA. Jerry worked with me and Lenny at Nairobi, and Jerry was an integral part of processing all these vehicles. So he, day in and day out, taking these vehicles and identifying them by VIN number, going through and cataloging. For instance, we had John O'Neill, the other retired agent that was killed in 9/11. We found his car. He just retired on Friday and went to work up there on a Monday, and still he had stuff that he cleaned out of his desk in the back of his car. So all that stuff, got all that stuff back to the family. Jerry was a valuable asset up there at Fresh Kills, and he felt very passionate about Lenny, as all of us do. I still have the missing flyer for Lenny, hangs at my desk to this day. It's followed me my entire career. It's hung at every desk I've sat at in the FBI because Lenny is still out there.
He unfortunately was one of the people whose remains were never recovered.
That's correct. But, Lenny lives on through his wonderful family. It lives on through the agents that still serve today. Many years later, when we did our tours in Iraq, many people from the Philly office went over and worked in Iraq in 2004. And to see Lenny and John O'Neill's names up in the rec hall over there and our little base of operations over in Iraq, they kind of officially named an area of the building there, the Lenny Hatton and John O'Neill Memorial area. It's really kind of poignant to see that. And like I said, every day I see Lenny's face on my desk, and it's just a reminder every day.
Richard, your 9/11 recovery work, recovering evidence and the remains and belongings of the victims of 9/11, was recognized, and you received a Simon H. Hyman Service to America Medal. You were the 2003 finalist for the Safety, Security, and International Affairs Award. And the SAMMys, as they're called, is kind of the Oscars of government service.
Really, it was so many other people. I was just part of it. People like Jimmy, Dennis, all the folks that responded to the 24,000 people that were up there. That award recognizes what they contributed to finding the missing victims of 9/11. When you see that work, it's very fresh in my head. I could still see it today. For instance, I'm watching Discovery Channel and I'm seeing a documentary on how they raised this sunken ship off the bottom of the ocean. And it switches to a picture of Fresh Kills Landfill in the middle of this documentary. And it's showing the hard work that the agents and the detectives did up there. That speaks volume to the work that they did, because the mindset of these people were here you have a mass casualty event on a car transport ship that sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And they said, look, if these folks can sift through all of the debris at 9/11 to find all the missing people, we can raise this ship up off the bottom of the ocean. So the work that all those folks, the agents and the detectives did up there, and the countless other people, the work that they did became a benchmark in a lot of ways. And so when you see current events, where they're sifting for everybody and the mayor says they're going to identify everybody, that's the same words that happened during 9/11 when they said they were going to identify everybody from the trade centers. And they're still working on it to this day. So it's just, I'm fortunate to be surrounded by so many good people that worked up there. And I know that when I see the victims' family members out at some museum where they're looking at something, somebody recognizes me. A little more difficult now because my hair is a little bit grayer than it used to be, but it's very rewarding because I know the family members mean it. And that's all the opinion that really mattered to me in the end, was what the families thought of our work as a group. Proud to have been a part of that team up on top of that hill in Staten Island.
Well, and I know we talked about at the very beginning how it's kind of unbelievable for us that it's been 20 years, and even to recognize that there may be young people listening to this episode who were not alive when this tragic event occurred. How do you feel it's being remembered? Now, we're recording this a few months before the actual ceremonies acknowledging the 20th anniversary are going to start. But how do you feel right now this country remembers 9/11?
My son, he's 14 now, wasn't alive at that point. Ironically, that's how I met my wife, was actually giving a talk about this to my old job. But, he sees it, and I got to think it's a lot like most of us that grew up after World War II. Pearl Harbor was a defining event, right? And, as history goes on and those people and their stories die off, it becomes less of a subject. But I think this provided so many valuable talking points about, here you have a disaster, it reaches all across all the ethnicities, religions, age demographics, everything. And it brought people together. And it was, the world was such a much better place for an extended period of time. And people helped each other and were kind. And, the work that the police and the firefighters did went recognized. And, because there were such huge casualties on both the police and fire. And it continues to this day with the health issues that many of them are suffering from, which is a very important thing that a lot of people have to remember, that 9/11 is still claiming victims to this day. So it's the point where America came together under a very horrific terrorist attack to be their best.
You now are the supervisor for the evidence response unit down at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. So you are carrying on this work in a management level, and many of the things that you do and the teams all through the country do is to respond to mass casualties. I think it's appropriate to talk about the lessons learned from your time at Fresh Kills, doing the recovery for the Twin Towers, and how those lessons now help you when you come to a mass casualty.
When you deal with mass casualty events, it's obviously I'll learn from every one of them. None of them are ever going to be the same, right? So one, you'll have a big building collapse like 9/11. You'll have a post-blast scene like Nashville bombings. You'll have a mass shooting like the Pulse nightclub or Las Vegas. All of those scenes bring different challenges. And I would dare say that one of the consistent things amongst all of those scenes is the laboratory. ERT people from across the country from our ERT teams respond to many of those events and share commonalities. But I think the lab folks that work in our firearms and tool marks unit, explosives, our operational projects unit, our technical hazards unit, all of these folks, and even ERTU, all of those folks work multiple scenes consistently across the country. It's the same group of people. They bring their expertise and their professionalism to every scene, and they really do a lot of work, because when you think about it, you'll have a mass shooting one month in California, next month it might be in Florida, And so the field offices change, the state and local elements change as well. So the people from the laboratory division that come out, the photographers, the visual specialists that put together our spherical photography or our laser scanning, they're all the same people that work the Las Vegas shootings, the Dallas shootings, San Bernardino, all of these events. It's the same quality of people. So it's definitely a learning curve, and the expertise is really lies amongst a few very talented people in the laboratory that can do that stuff. So it's great to be a part of that group of people. I love working with every one of them, but it's something that we've developed over time. And so when we go in somewhere like El Paso Walmart shooting, or you go into Virginia Beach shooting, or even the Navy Yard right here in Washington, D.C., and you can talk with state and locals and say, hey, look, this is what we're going to bring to you. Even though you're prosecuting it, this is what we can help you with as far as documentation. And so when we lay out that and show them a little bit of a sample of our work, I think it's a great way to win them over and show that we're just there to help them. Because a lot of times these affect our local ERT teams because it happens in their city. Something like the Pulse nightclub, it affects so many people around, or Las Vegas. And so for us to be able to come in and provide that outside help and guidance is really important for us to be a part of that. Again, it's that same service to the victims' families and the victims, because I would want that. That's the premise I operate on. If it was my family, that's the kind of service I would want, being under every stone and doing what we could to identify the bad guys, bringing justice to it if we can. So something like the Nashville bombing, that's what we did. We literally collected every scrap and piece out there that we needed to find to identify this particular device. So, working with the bomb techs and state and local partners there is very important to us. We learn from each one of these scenes.
Give us a picture of what it's like as an evidence response team responds to a mass casualty event. Can you break down some of the steps? Now, I did talk to retired agent Jean O'Connor, who was the senior team leader at the Washington field office, and she talked a little bit about ERT and what they do at a general crime scene. I'm talking about these mass shootings, mass casualty events that unfortunately we're hearing about more and more on the news.
Sure. When you have a mass casualty event, whether it be a plane crash or a mass shooting, typically we hear about it first from either the news media or the social media accounts of other people, because realistically, they're going to be there first on scene. They're going to be the first people to say, hey, we've got a report coming in. There's a mass shooting at a mall or a school. So that's how we're going to hear about it. But we start tracking it. We start talking to local field offices. It can be a very slow process because you may have an active shooter scene where the active shooter, they don't know where he is. They don't know if there's more than one because you've got multiple 911 calls coming in, and it's sometimes confusing. Is it the same person? Is it a different person? Then you find out at the end it pertains to one person, but seen by two different people. So when you respond to a scene, you still got to get your team there. For an evidence response team in a field office, they're responding from their day-to-day activities because many of them are case agents. They've got other jobs in the office. You're just a member of the team. So when it's activated, you have to leave your casework, whatever you're doing in the office, go out and respond and show up at the scene. So when you get out there, many times if you're dealing with like a mass shooting, there might be belief that unexploded improvised devices, explosive devices inside the scene. So the building has to be cleared by bomb techs. You have to wait for the SWAT teams to make sure that they've cleared the entire building, that there's nobody else in the building, that they've gotten all the victims identified, that they've gotten all the people that out of the building that need to be out, that they're not dealing with a hostage situation. So that takes a little bit of time. And then methodically, you have to start photographing the scene as soon as you get there, which is very time consuming because you only get one chance to photograph that scene correctly in its initial stage. That usually takes the longest part because you have to start photographing that scene and documenting it. And then you have to look at the totality of what you've got. Is it a mass shooting? How many rounds? I mean, if you look at something like the Las Vegas shooting and how many rounds that the individual shot, you've got a large area. So you start documenting the scene. You start seeing how much trajectory evidence. Are you going to have the firearms and tool marks unit come out? What are the photographers, the operational project unit, what are they going to have to photograph? So you start getting a sense of the overall complexity of the scene, how much is there? Because realistically, what we're trying to do from the evidence response team is to tell a story. You go in, you observe what you see, You try to figure out what happened at the scene. You have to present that in documentation, whether it be photographs or collecting the evidence. And so eventually the case agent's going to have to take that and send it to the laboratory and get it analyzed. And that tells the story of what happened at the scene. And so you're really a detective trying to put that pieces together. And I think that's the allure of the evidence response team, is because you get to see items of evidence before anybody else does. You get to see things like the pressure cooker in the Boston bombing. And you know right up front with the SABTs, the bomb techs, that this is a crucial piece of evidence and you're the first people to lay eyes on it. So it changes direction of a case quickly. You know, Oklahoma City, the axle from that Ryder rental truck that was blown up, that changed the direction of that case instantaneously. So when you find that item of evidence, it's very rewarding.
Oh, that's the one where the VIN number was found.
Right. So they were able to trace it back to the rental company and show that Timothy McVeigh rented that vehicle and used it as a car bomb, basically, to blow up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma. You find that one crucial piece of evidence that changes the direction of the case. It's very rewarding. So that's part of what we do when we go through a scene like the Navy Yard or the Pulse nightclub. Who did this? Is it something else that's going to happen again? You know, do we have a potential another type? Because that's a priority, really. When you're on scene for these things, is okay, we've had a bombing in Nashville. Is this something that's going to happen again in short order? Can we stop another attack? That's the focus of the FBI at that point, is really trying to get its arms around it. And that's where, you know, you see how beautiful we run on a large scale, because we're able to reach across state lines, go to other cities, track down information on individuals, where they previously lived, you know, what their criminal history is, if there is any, and really put boots to the ground and interviewing people in quick order. And, you know, that's one of the benefits of what we bring to the table. So it's very rewarding to see that. But when you get on the scene, a lot of times as an evidence response team member, you're really trying to deal with reining in chaos. That's what I feel like when I get there, is because you're bringing order to chaos. And, you know, you're really trying to define the boundaries of the scene. You know, how far out are we finding evidence? How big is my scene? How many people do I need? Do I need more people? Do I need less people? What other technical assets do I need? Do I need drone operators? Do I need total stations to measure in specific evidence? So it's a large responsibility in addition to managing people. So you have to really be outgoing and be able to direct people clearly, give them expertise and advice. And I think that's one of the things that we like to be able to do from the laboratory division when we go out to these things. Is many times we have a large scale event. It'll be our third or fourth one of the year. And so we provide some continuity about what we've done at past scenes around the country when we move around and respond to these.
How many of these do you actually go to?
I'm currently a supervisor in the operational response part of the evidence response team. So we have agents that respond out to these large scenes. Depending on the year and the number of shootings that happen in a year, I can be gone, on a calendar year, I could be gone the equivalent of several months out of the year. I think the longest I've been deployed internationally, I was 21 days when the MH17, the Malaysian airliner, was shot down over the Ukraine. Our team went over and identified individuals on that plane. We spent 21 days between the Netherlands and the Ukraine working that scene with the Dutch authorities, the Dutch DVI, disaster victim identification folks, and the Ukraine. You know, here, you know, you do something like, you look at Las Vegas, you know, that was a deployment of roughly about 15, 16 days. Pulse nightclub was 9 days. The Navy Yard was almost close to 20 days. Some of these scenes when we go out on, myself and a lot of those, I've been on every one of those scenes just about. It adds up, you know, as far as days away from home and family and traveling. So it's just something, you know, that you're going out the door. You just don't know when you're coming back, because you just don't know. As the lab team, we just know that we're going to be probably working 14-hour days to get it done and help a city get back to normal as soon as possible. So that's our main objective. When we go out, we interact with the field office. We want to help them with their local partners there to get the scene documented, get it processed, and give the city back as quickly as possible, because we don't want to tie a city up longer than we have to.
Well, we've been talking about you responding to criminal events. Could you talk a little bit about disasters and what the unit does in those tragic events?
Many people don't realize that the laboratory division can also help in humanitarian missions as well. We do scenes like Hurricane Katrina. We've done the Thai tsunami in 2005. We've done Ethiopian air crash, flight 302 that went down in Addis Ababa. We responded. So the laboratory has a disaster victim identification team, TVI. that most countries like Interpol has a very robust TBI system to help identify people that have been involved in natural disasters or accidents. So, for instance, if you take the most recent condo disaster in Florida, we had vigils from our disaster victim identification team down there assisting the state and locals. It's a state and local case, but we're just happy to be able to help out whatever way we can and give them guidance. To be able to send some of our folks down that can help, we're just glad to do so. So the Bureau has that ability in natural disasters to help and provide assistance in identifying deceased individuals, especially if the remains have been fragmented, like in a big plane crash, or have been submersed in water, like in a Thai tsunami. So it's important for those folks to be able to help and assist people maybe that don't have that type of experience. Part of what we do with the evidence response team, and a lot of it has come out of the 9/11 tragedy, is how we interact with our victim services division, which was formerly known as the Office of Victim Assistance, OVA. It's now Victim Services, VSD. We work hand in hand with VSD to try to get personal effects back to loved ones as soon as possible. When we have a Pulse nightclub shooting or a Vegas shooting, take, for instance, the work that Rod Swanson did out there in Las Vegas. Much of that inner concert field was littered with personal effects that were just dropped, whether it be 1,000 lawn chairs or shoes or wallets, phones. All of that stuff had an owner at some point. So our victim services division, along with the evidence response teams out there, work to identify items that are not items of evidence, that are personal effects. And we try to get those things back to people as soon as possible. Because when you think about it, you have something like a Pulse nightclub shooting. When they put a perimeter around it and shut it down, people's cars get locked within that police perimeter. A lot of those cars don't have bullet holes in them, and the ones that do, we'll scan and document them. But the other ones, people have their whole life sometimes in cars. They have their wallets. They can't pay for things. They have their checkbooks. They have medication. All of that stuff needs to get back to somebody in a timely fashion. So we've learned over time, and it's really become a real good process with our victim services. They work hand in hand with our ART people. Once we get something identified that we don't need it as evidence, we get it out and give it back to the victim as soon as possible. And that's where our victim services folks really hit the ball out of the park, because they go in and they make sure that the items are returned to the family member in a timely fashion. They also make sure that if there's any contamination like blood or anything like that, that they get it cleaned and returned to the family member. But they work hand in hand with the NTSB. If it's a plane crash, they work hand in hand with many other federal partners doing the best that they can for these victims' families to get them the items back in a timely fashion.
So we're at the point of the interview where I like to ask my guest when and why they joined the FBI. So what's your FBI origin story?
So I started out a little bit biased because my father and my mother worked for the FBI. My father, Dick Marx, he became an agent in 1964. He used to clerk on the same floor as Mr. Hoover, and he met my mom. My mom was working in the IDENT division at that time, Ardell Marx, and they worked in D.C., got married. Their first field office was Tampa, and my father got sent to Birmingham in 1967 at the height of the civil rights movement. So he worked church bombing, Martin Luther King assassination. So he was right in the mix of it, and the Bureau's face has changed, from a time period of when, my father was chasing draft dodgers from the Vietnam War to, now we're working all these international big shooting cases, big cases across the country. At that time they were working stolen cars and draft dodgers and things. So a lot of the focus of cyber terrorism was not even thought of at that particular point. So, the Bureau's mission is constantly evolving to take on the biggest threats. But I started as a Bureau family. And so at some point, I always knew I was going to go into the FBI. I went to school. I got a degree in chemistry, thinking I eventually would be in the FBI laboratory. But I started working at a state crime lab, Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. I was in the Huntsville Regional Laboratory for 12 years. I worked my way up through every position in the lab, all the way from volunteer, which is how I started. I started at age 17 in high school as a volunteer. Then I eventually became a testifying examiner. I was working in the firearms and tool marks unit in the Huntsville lab. I'd been a trace microscopist for years. I learned so much from people in the laboratory there, like John Kilburn and Roger Morrison. Those guys taught me more about forensics than anybody I could ever think of. So I was working in forensics for 12 years before I came to the FBI. And then when I got into the FBI, I was giving a presentation. We had been in a hiring freeze. government had been on a hiring freeze since like 1995. And I was just waiting, 2 years I've been waiting. And I was giving a presentation about firearms at a instructor development course. And the guy said, have you thought about being an FBI agent? And I said, it's funny you should mention that. And he turned out he was a recruiter for the Birmingham office. And it worked out that the timing was right. And then I went into the Bureau in March of 1997, and I've been here ever since. And I feel very passionate about what I do. And my first office was Philadelphia office. I started there in 1997, and I left there in 2006 to come down to the laboratory division. But I still have very fond memories of being on Jim Sweeney's squad, the drug squad, Squad 2, the bank robbery squad with Mike Carbonell, and I'm glad to do what I can for the lab here now.
I'd like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, I think it's important to leave it on the 9/11 note, right? Because this is what we started this interview about. We should harken back to that time after the attacks, as tragic as it was. The FBI works with so many countless state and local folks, and it's easy to do. I think it's something all of us should strive to do. And I just want everybody to take a moment to think of the victims and their families, because like all of us that worked that event, everybody that's listening to this that was a part of that event, you know how fresh it is in your mind still to this day. If you were there, make sure you get your health checkups and be a part of the health monitoring for the World Trade Center health monitoring program. But remember those days after it and how we all came together as a nation and helped each other and comforted each other in those times of need. And I think that's really one of the more important things that we take away from this horrific and tragic event.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Richard Marx and links to several news articles and videos about the Fresh Kills recovery operation. There are also images from Richard's personal photo collection of the site. You'll also find links to other FBI retired case file review episodes focused on the terrorist attacks of 9/11. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. And make sure you follow FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.